On your feet. Now.
I cannot stand. I am paralyzed.
Stop resisting.
I am not resisting.
It was 10:45 a.m. on a quiet Wednesday morning, March 15th, 2023, inside the sterile corridors of the VA hospital in Dallas, Texas. The kind of day that should have been routine, calm, uneventful. But for Samantha Hayes, 38, a paralyzed Army veteran, this was anything but normal. She had fought 2 tours overseas, survived firefights that would break most people, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to happen in the place meant to protect her. Samantha wheeled herself down the hallway, her hands gripping the rims of her wheelchair, eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. Nurses greeted her warmly, staff nodded as she passed. She had appointments here every few weeks, physical therapy, checkups, medication management. But today, there was a tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. Her aide, Jordan Miles, 29, walked alongside, carrying a small medical bag. "Everything's fine," he reassured her, but even he seemed uneasy. Then came Officer Michael Trent, 42, patrolling the hallway. On paper, he was a seasoned law enforcement officer, but his reputation inside the hospital whispered a different story. Quick temper, aggressive tactics, a history of complaints. Trent's eyes locked on Samantha. There was a flash of recognition, or maybe irritation. No one was sure. And then it happened. Without warning, Trent stepped forward, voice cold and commanding, "You're under arrest." Samantha froze. Jordan froze. The nurses froze. Confusion rippled through the waiting room. "What? For what?" Samantha asked, her voice steady but incredulous. She was paralyzed. How could she even resist? How could this be real? CCTV cameras quietly recorded every second, capturing the moment the unthinkable unfolded. A paralyzed veteran, handcuffed in her wheelchair, inside a hospital, a place of care, safety, and trust. Whispers grew, phones lifted, staff whispered urgently, "This isn't right." But Trent didn't hesitate. He was certain of his authority, blind to the humanity before him. And while the hospital protocol required patient rights to be respected, Samantha's ordeal had already begun. In the background, Jordan tried to intervene, pleading with Trent to consider her medical condition, but the officer's rigidity was unyielding. The tension in the room was palpable. Patients looked on, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. Samantha's heart pounded. She had survived combat, survived injury, survived life-altering paralysis. But this was something entirely different. And just like that, the day that should have been routine became a moment that would shock the nation. The kind of injustice that would eventually cost the rogue officer a $1 million lawsuit. But the story didn't end there, because as Samantha was wheeled towards an uncertain fate, the question hung in the air. How could this happen inside a federal hospital, under the watch of people sworn to protect her? The camera lingers, the scene freezes, and the audience is left asking, what happens next? It all started like any other morning at the VA hospital, but tension was already in the air, subtle, almost invisible. Samantha Hayes in her wheelchair had been expecting a routine appointment with Dr. Lisa Romero, 45, her longtime physician. Today was supposed to be about adjusting medications and discussing therapy plans, nothing more. Yet as Samantha rolled into the consultation wing, the usual calm was pierced by the sharp presence of Officer Michael Trent. He wasn't there for routine security. He was watching, his eyes cold and calculating, his walk measured. Samantha tried to shake off the unease. She had seen Trent before. He patrolled the hallways like a storm cloud, and staff whispered about past incidents. "He's strict," Jordan Miles had warned, "but sometimes too strict." There had been minor altercations before, patients' families being questioned aggressively, staff caught between hospital protocol and Trent's authority. Samantha had learned to navigate these halls cautiously. As she approached Dr. Romero's office, Trent stepped in her path, blocking the corridor. "Samantha Hayes, I need to speak with you." The words were calm, but carried an undercurrent of threat. Samantha's brow furrowed. "About what? I have an appointment," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Jordan interjected. "She's paralyzed. She can barely move, let alone comply with whatever you're thinking." The nurse at the front desk looked worried. "Officer, she's a patient. There are procedures, medical considerations." Trent ignored the protests. His eyes were fixed on Samantha. Something about the way he moved suggested he had made a decision in his mind, one he was unwilling to reconsider. And then, without warning, he reached for his cuffs. The atmosphere froze. Staff stepped back, some calling for help, others watching in disbelief. Samantha's heart raced. She had survived explosions, ambushes, and gunfire overseas, but she was powerless here, in her wheelchair, surrounded by people sworn to protect her. Her mind raced. How could this be happening? Could someone really be arresting her inside a hospital? Where was the chain of command, the protocols, the law? Everything she thought she knew about safety inside the VA had just been stripped away. As Trent tightened the cuffs around her wrists, Samantha's eyes met Jordan's. His expression was a mix of anger, fear, and helplessness. The nurses whispered urgently, "Call security, call the doctor." But it was too late. The rogue officer was already moving her towards the exit. And in that instant, the ordinary hospital corridor transformed into a battleground of authority, rights, and raw injustice. The question echoed in everyone's mind. How far would Trent go, and who would stop him before it was too late? The hospital hallway had never felt colder. Samantha Hayes, handcuffed and seated in her wheelchair, was being escorted by Officer Michael Trent as whispers and stares followed them like shadows. The hum of fluorescent lights felt oppressive, each flicker magnifying the absurdity of the moment. Patients craned their necks, nurses exchanged worried glances, and Jordan Miles, her aide, trailed closely, his hands clenched in frustration. Trent's voice was firm, almost mechanical. "Move along, no one interferes." But this was no ordinary arrest. Samantha was paralyzed from the waist down. She couldn't walk, couldn't resist physically, couldn't even understand why this was happening. The sheer injustice gnawed at her chest. She had served her country, she had risked everything overseas, and here she was, powerless, humiliated, trapped by someone sworn to protect public safety. Jordan pleaded, "Officer, you can't do this. She's medically immobile. You're violating hospital protocol." But Trent ignored him, his eyes fixed forward, as if Samantha were just another obstacle. The tension in the air thickened with each passing step. Other staff tried to intervene, some subtly guiding patients away, some reaching for phones to call hospital administration. But Trent's presence was imposing. No one dared confront him directly. Samantha's mind raced. How could a law enforcement officer act with such disregard inside a federal facility? Her fingers trembled on the wheelchair rims, not from fear, but from the anger of being treated like a criminal for simply existing. And then the whispers began to spread beyond the hospital. The CCTV cameras captured the unfolding scene, phones discreetly recorded. Within minutes, the incident was no longer private. It had the potential to explode into a scandal. The stakes had escalated beyond embarrassment. Samantha's rights had been violated, hospital procedures were disregarded, and the psychological weight of being publicly humiliated in a place of care pressed heavily on her shoulders. Just as Trent reached the hospital exit, Samantha's voice broke through the mechanical calm. "You can't do this. This is illegal." Her words were sharp, piercing the tense silence. Yet Trent pressed on, unfazed, oblivious to the growing crowd and the cameras capturing every moment. And then, a sudden jolt of tension. Jordan lunged to block the doorway, desperate, pleading with authority to intervene. The hallway seemed to freeze. Staff held their breath. The world outside that hospital was about to find out what happens when power goes unchecked. The question lingered. Would anyone step in before this nightmare escalated any further, or was Samantha's fight just beginning? By the time Samantha Hayes was wheeled into the hospital lobby, the scene had already transformed into chaos. Voices overlapped, patients calling out in confusion, nurses arguing quietly among themselves, and hospital security debating whether they could intervene without provoking Trent. CCTV cameras from security systems and cell phones captured every angle, every moment of the unfolding nightmare. What had begun as a routine appointment was now a spectacle, a storm brewing inside the walls of a place meant for healing. Trent's expression remained unreadable, a mask of authority that ignored the human devastation in front of him. Samantha's wrists ached from the tight cuffs, her body stiff from hours of paralysis, and yet her eyes burned with defiance. She refused to let fear control her. She had faced far worse overseas, and though vulnerable, she still carried the spirit of a soldier. Meanwhile, Jordan Miles worked tirelessly, moving between staff and the officer, explaining Samantha's medical needs, citing federal regulations, pleading with anyone who would listen. But Trent was resolute. For him, rules and empathy were secondary to control. The tension escalated further when other patients began recording, phones lifted in disbelief. The hospital lobby was now a courtroom of public opinion, with Trent on trial in front of witnesses he hadn't anticipated. That's when legal counsel entered the frame. Clara Nguyen, 41, a seasoned veteran rights attorney. She had been monitoring hospital security alerts and immediately recognized the potential for a civil rights violation. With every second, she prepared to gather evidence that would not only defend